Hello, I'm Tom Rothman of 20th Century Fox. Welcome to Fox Legacy. We're happy to have you with us.
Give me a UB and whiskey.
They start Liberty again?
Nah, transfer into a new ship, San Pablo.
You can have my part of that. Them gunboats are nothing.
Well, they got engines, ain't they?
Sure.
Well, then they ain't nothing.
Cool. That indefinable, ineffable, enduring word. That thing that every guy alive wants to possess for just a moment or two, once or twice in their entire lives. That attitude that I couldn't explain to my parents and that now my kids think I'm the opposite of. You can try to define it, to capture it, to dress it or bottle it or sell it, and you'll fail. Or you can look at the work and the short, complex, contradictory life of the star of tonight's film, Steve McQueen, and just experience the full force and impact of cool. Steve McQueen was so entirely, absolutely cool that he even looks cool in the silly sailor hat and short white pants he wears in most of the Sand Pebbles, Robert Wise's epic film nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including the only Best Actor nomination Steve McQueen ever received, and accordingly, the film that marked the pinnacle of the career of cool. Now, there are many different styles of film acting, highly technical ones that result from years of careful study and artistry. Think Laurence Olivier, Meryl Streep. Emotive ones that rely on explosive, combustive power, De Niro, Pacino. And occasionally, reductive ones that strip away everything between the character and the actor and the audience and exist in the inner life conveyed by the actor's very presence on screen. Think Gary Cooper, Denzel Washington, Clint Eastwood. This last style is, to me, the hardest and the rarest. It takes hard work, of course, but also a natural gift, like a born athlete, to have the camera read feelings without seeing effort to project those feelings. There never was an actor who could do more with less, by which I mean less mannerism, less dialogue, less apparent acting with a capital A, than Steve McQueen. When I try to tell my colleagues who are developing scripts with endless dialogues where the characters tell us what they are thinking or feeling, that no words can match one great look in a well-dramatized situation, I like to point them to the scene in tonight's film where the Chinese mob is demanding the hero's head, and even his own crew is chanting his name to turn him over.
Ho Meng! Come down! Ho Meng! Come down! Ho Meng! Come down! Ho Meng! Come down! Ho Meng! Come down!
And Steve McQueen just stands stoically on the bridge of the San Pablo, saying nothing and conveying everything. This is so much harder than it looks. Only an infinitesimal number of humans can do very little and yet be interesting and emotional, not boring and dull. Sometimes, though not always, for such reductive actors, it seems that their public and private personas are very closely linked, if not interchangeable. They aren't acting so much as being who they really are. Steve McQueen was likely the greatest of such stars. He was a well of conflicting qualities that somehow all fit perfectly together. Rebellious, heroic. Tough, vulnerable. Lover, loner, patriot, troublemaker. With his cutting blue eyes and his rugged looks and unassuming charisma, he was a rough and tumble American leading man in an era when the industry was otherwise investing in top-billed British imports. Steve McQueen never had to put on machismo. He never had to force being cool. He just was. If you watch him in The Great Escape, Bullet, or the film you're about to see, The Sand Pebbles, you get a very real sense that Steve McQueen had lived all this before. And to a great extent, he had. Steve McQueen grew up hard and fast. Abandoned by his father at a young age and mistreated by his mother, who actually resorted to prostitution to make a living, McQueen became the loner, rebel, tough guy, all at a very young age. In 1945, his mother and stepfather filed court documents declaring him incorrigible, and he was sent to a reformatory for delinquents, the terrifically named Junior Boys Republic in Chino. He spent 14 months at the facility, during which he escaped 5 times. Eventually, he was on his own at the young age of 15. Soon he landed in the Marines, where he served for 3 years. He even saved a few lives when a boat capsized in Canada. Heroic action worthy of the Sand Pebbles, no doubt. But he also extended a 2-day pass into a 2-week fling with a girlfriend and was punished with 41 days in the ship's brig. You see, the tension within him between hero and tortured rebel was firmly established early on. McQueen spent some time pursuing his favorite interests, which were, naturally enough, booze, women, and motorcycles, all the while flailing from job to job, city to city, barely getting by. Then, in 1952, one of his many girlfriends, herself an actress, goaded him into trying acting. He was accepted at Stanford Meisner's neighborhood playhouse, and eventually into Lee Strasberg's actor studio, where Marilyn Monroe herself studied. His combination of machismo, charm, and raw talent sped him quickly into a working career in acting, and he liked the money and the access to women that came along with it. In his first big screen appearance, McQueen had a small $19 a day, uncredited role in the film Somebody Up There Likes Me, directed by Robert Wise, who would later direct The Sand Pebbles. Wise gave the young actor a shot because he was intrigued with McQueen's cocky attitude. That movie starred Paul Newman, the period's other great blonde, blue-eyed male lead. Comparison over the years were inevitable, and McQueen spent years in Newman's shadow. From early on, McQueen set his own sights on surpassing Newman's career, and he was driven by a raging competitiveness. McQueen obsessively wanted to beat Newman to become the biggest movie star in the world. Faye Dunaway, his co-star in the Thomas Crown Affair, actually said that McQueen used to brag, "You know, it takes 2 Paul Newman autographs to buy 1 Steve McQueen." Success on the small screen would come in the series Wanted, Dead or Alive, where he played an anti-hero bounty hunter. And on the big screen, The Magnificent Seven was meant to be Yul Brynner's picture, but it was McQueen who made the biggest impact. And after the huge success of The Great Escape in 1963, Steve McQueen became a bona fide movie star. Indeed, he became the first true international action star. And McQueen was finally in a position where he could dictate his own career moves, but still he felt he was eating leftover projects that Paul Newman rejected. Newman was the first choice to star in tonight's film back in 1962 when the project went into development. But by the time it started shooting, it was a different story. Now, The Sand Pebbles is based on a popular Richard McKenna 1962 novel, and it shows us politically disjointed 1920s China from a Western outsider's perspective. Because of its complexities, the project took years to develop. It was championed by director Robert Wise, who at the time was still earning the moniker legendary that now goes before his title. Wise started as a messenger boy for RKO before he got tapped to edit a movie from a first-time director named Orson Welles, and that movie was Citizen Kane. It catapulted Wise into a phenomenal directing career, including the original Day the Earth Stood Still, The Haunting, and West Side Story. Wise, the sort of anti-John Ford, I guess you could say, was a gentleman, a craftsman, and a studio-friendly director. And Robert Wise is the reason I'm standing here today. For it was his film, The Sound of Music, that saved 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy, and this stage from being home to an office tower instead. You see, in 1962, when Wise brought the Sand Pebbles to Fox from United Artists, who, understanding the scope and expense of the project, knew they couldn't afford it, well, Fox couldn't afford it either. The studio at that time was drowning in cost overruns on Cleopatra and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. So Wise, in the meantime, came aboard a movie called The Sound of Music. Under his direction, The Sound of Music went on to become one of the biggest movies of all time, rescuing Fox in the process. Wise, by the way, actually heard news of his Academy Award win for The Sound of Music while he was on board the ship, the San Pablo, directing Sand Pebbles. Because Sound of Music's success had both saved the studio and at the same time given Robert Wise the clout to get a movie as difficult as The Sand Pebbles made. Now, part of what made The Sand Pebbles so hard to make at the time was it wasn't a rah-rah, raise the flag war picture that was very popular in the era. The story has a complex moral message about racism. McQueen's character, to me, himself begins with racist assumptions of his own. It's about civil rights, and it asks tough questions about imperialism. The movie was perhaps a few years ahead of its time in its examination of America's role as international interloper. Although set in a conflict 40 years earlier, the parallels to the then-building Vietnam War were hard to avoid. And to me, 40 years still later, in our present global climate, the ambiguities and contradictions of the historical conflict have lost none of their relevance. The movie's Jake Holman isn't interested in fighting, yet he fights heroically. He doesn't care about politics, yet politics inform every one of his decisions. And for all of its violence, the message of the film is ultimately a cry for peace. Like his character, McQueen was notoriously difficult. He fought with fellow actors. He fought with directors wanting to see dailies, which are the footage shot each day so he could second guess what the director was doing. He fought with screenwriters, never wanting to say their words because he knew his acting came best from not saying words. In fact, Academy Award nominated screenwriter Robert Anderson was actually fired during the filming of this movie because of his battles with McQueen. McQueen would also sulk, one time not talking to Robert Wise for 2 weeks. But he knew himself, and he understood fully his screen persona. And perhaps it made it easier when the roles he instinctively selected were so close to home. Let's look at the actual parallels between McQueen and this film. He was a Marine. His character, Jake Holman's in the Navy. Both used the military to escape from a troubled life. Both loved machinery. McQueen actually once got in trouble in the Marines for trying to soup up a tank engine. And in the moment where Holman says he had only his mother, and he says, quote, "She didn't count for much, but was a good dame," you have to wonder about his feelings for his abandoned prostitute mother who died of alcohol abuse. You see, The Sand Pebbles, in many ways, was the tipping point in Steve McQueen's career. He received his one and only Oscar nomination and became an actor who could carry an important picture. He had made it to the Pantheon. There would be more hits to follow, to be sure, but he'd proven it. How he responded to that success is in some ways tragic, and I'll tell you a little bit about it after the movie, but in his heyday, Steve McQueen instinctively knew one key thing about himself, about Hollywood, and about the power of cool. As his character Jake Holman says in the movie, long as you're good at something, they can't bust you down. Steve McQueen was more than good, and no one was going to bust him down. See you after the movie. Have fun. The Sand Pebbles was released as what was known in the 1960s as a roadshow picture. At the time, prestigious movies were shown only twice a day, with assigned seats and usually an intermission, thus mirroring the experience of going to a Broadway play. And it worked for years on big movies like Ben-Hur, Sound of Music, and Patton. Although Ultimately, that system gave way to movies being released on a more massive scale of thousands of screens simultaneously. It was the release of Jaws in 1975, all at once on 400 screens with a television advertising campaign. Two things, by the way, that were unheard of before that film would begin the permanent reshaping of the commercial film business into a marketing-led industry, where films now are often backed by upwards of $30 million of television and other media advertising before their first day of release. And that release is sometimes on as many as 8,000 screens in America or 20,000 screens worldwide. But back in 1966, the roadshow release of the Sand Pebbles led to an eventual $30 million in grosses, a great success then. And if you were wondering, that's why the movie you just watched had an intermission, albeit in tonight's case, only a few seconds. Unless you used your DVR to pause, you didn't really fully get to recreate the roadshow experience. But the Sand Pebbles was good for a lot of careers. It was 19-year-old Candice Bergen's first role in the beginning of a storied Hollywood life. Richard Attenborough went on to become Sir Richard Attenborough, win an Academy Award for directing Gandhi. For modern audiences, you probably know him best for playing the patriarch in Jurassic Park. Mako became one of the most prolific Asian actors of his generation. And Mariette Adrian, who played Mei Li, Attenborough's wife in the movie, well, she did very little acting afterwards, but she wrote the sexually charged novel Emmanuel, which went on to become a whole other kind of sensation. The Sand Pebbles was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, which it lost to A Man for All Seasons. McQueen lost Best Actor to that movie star Paul Scofield, who I had the honor to work with 30 years later in The Crucible. But after Sand Pebbles, McQueen's career had an extra dose of gravitas, and his success would continue with The Thomas Crown Affair, Bullet, The Getaway, and Papillon. He lived a wild life. His personal exploits were tabloid fodder. He made it onto Nixon's enemies list, and he almost had dinner at Sharon Tate's house the night of the infamous Manson murders. Ultimately, his career reached the crescendo in Fox's The Towering Inferno, where he finally caught up to Paul Newman by getting top billing, although there were some lawyer tricks involved. You see, McQueen's name comes first, but Newman's name's actually higher. The two of them could have starred together sooner in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but they could never agree over who got top billing. Inferno was a huge hit, and McQueen was, arguably, bigger than Newman in that moment. He was now passing on scripts that Newman would go on to do, a reversal of fortune that he'd long desired. And yet, his career was essentially over. Perhaps reaching his goal of beating Newman, Captain Ahab having finally caught his white whale was enough, and he was done. Or perhaps the years of hard living took their toll. More so than ever, his life revolved around drugs, alcohol, and women, including a famous affair with Getaway co-star Alan McGraw, then married to Paramount studio head Robert Evans. Now, just to give you a little perspective, you see, Getaway was initially a Paramount film. If you ever had any doubt that Steve McQueen really, truly did not give a damn. Indeed, he used to proudly tell people that he told Richard Zanuck in the fight over billing on Butch Cassidy, "F you, I'm Steve McQueen." He routinely pushed the limits with his racing interests, with speed surely providing another kind of escapist high. He struggled with bouts of paranoia, which later in his life actually grew very acute. McQueen severed all press relations entirely in 1970, and his cocaine use caused him to be more aggressive and megalomaniacal. He descended into a phase where he grew his hair long, gained weight, and was barely identifiable. Director Norman Jewison, who had directed him in the Thomas Crown Affair maybe 10 years earlier, didn't even recognize him when McQueen walked over to say hi. He attempted a comeback of sorts, playing, of all things, a crusading Norwegian doctor in something called An Enemy of the People. But the film was thought so poor that it was actually never released. he had a more successful comeback 2 years later with Tom Horn and The Hunter. Movies comfortably within his action wheelhouse, but Steve McQueen was about to lose his greatest battle. He was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer associated with asbestos exposure, perhaps from the work he did during his Marine days, or more likely from his fireproof protective gear in car racing. Given 3 months to live, he rejected traditional medicine and pursued alternate treatment in Mexico. But the cancer spread. And after an operation on a stomach tumor that doctors had told him was inoperable, he died the next day of heart failure. Steve McQueen was only 50 years old. There is no telling how his career would have evolved had he survived or had he conquered his demons instead of ultimately succumbing to them. But consider this. Since the age of 50, Clint Eastwood has acted in or directed about 30 films, including such classics as Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, Mystic River, and Gran Torino. What could Steve McQueen have given audiences over the years he should have remained with us? Well, it's an impossible question, of course, but maybe one with some hidden consolation within it, because all the hard racing and hard living that may have contributed to McQueen's untimely death must also have contributed to his unmatched screen persona. And so young people for generations can watch and marvel at his cool. For what the poet Edmund St. Vincent Millay wrote long ago could so easily apply to him still. My candle burns at both ends, she said. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. Or, if you prefer a more contemporary vernacular, Sheryl Crow. Like Steve McQueen, all I need is a fast machine. And now, there are 2 different McQueen biography pictures being developed in Hollywood as we speak. And about them, I ask just one question. Who the hell can play Steve McQueen?
Woman! Woman! Woman!
For Fox Legacy, I'm Tom Rothman. We'll see you next time.